Okay, so this is one of my favorite poems from Fragile Hearts Club. This is Being a Perfectionist is an Illness. Being a perfectionist is an illness, and it is the most dangerous thing about myself, because nothing I do will ever come close to the visions in my head, and I don't know how to deal with that. That's that one.
It's so real. It's so real. Hello, and welcome. As you know, I love exploring and dabbling in all sorts of art forms, but something in my brain doesn't quite click with literature. I have never been a reader, and something that I did learn in graduate school is that's okay. But I do understand that it is a whole world of self-expression that I haven't quite opened the door to. So where do I start? With the most abstract version of course, poetry! I met Rachael Lord while working on The Little Mermaid and Murder on the Orient Express at the Broadway Palm Theater in Fort Myers, Florida, where she played a singing and dancing mermaid to a Swedish missionary. When I discovered she was a published poet, I knew she would be perfect for Pique My Interest. So I buckled down and I read her first book. Poetry has really never spoken to me, but as an aspiring lyricist, I wanted to dive into exploring it. Her work is so personal and unique to Rachael, but it is very relatable and brings out emotions from within while telling a story. She herself is goofy, silly, and such a lovable human. This episode was recorded in Fort Myers, Florida, and some time ago, so some info might be a little old, but I hope that you can still use all the information to look up their work, and your interest is piqued. I hope you are having a grand day, and please enjoy this week's episode I've titled, It Doesn't Need to Make Sense. Hello, my beautiful people, and welcome to Pique My Interest, a podcast dedicated to creativity. My name is Scoob Decker, and I am an artist. This podcast was created to learn more about the different styles of art and, more importantly, meet some incredible artists and explore their craft and how they create. I'm here in Fort Myers, Florida, with an artist with a craft I know little about. So please, pique my interest about poetry.
I am Rachael Lord. I'm a poet, and I am so excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Scoop.
Oh, I'm so excited. Thank you for being here. I have worked with Rachael for the past month or so, working on The Little Mermaid at the Broadway Palm Theater, and we are currently in Murder on the Orient Express. Mm-hmm. She is brilliant on stage, and when I learned that she was a poet, I just had to learn more about it.
Aww.
For my peekers out there, if you don't know, I'm not the biggest reader. I'm not into the literature as much as other artists, so when I learned that one of my colleagues was a poet, I had to dive in. What is your specialty within poetry?
Yeah, so I write free verse short form. So what that means is that a lot of my poems don't follow a specific structure or a rhyme scheme. I write very freely and however I want to, and most of my poems are very short.
Okay, I'm sure we'll get more into that later.
Yes, for sure.
But what is your background?
So I've been writing since I was probably about 7. I started in 2nd grade doing like creative writing in the beginning of school each day for like 45 minutes. I used to write these little short stories. So I've been writing ever since then. I have my bachelor's degree in musical theater. And while I was doing my bachelor's degree, I took a creative writing class in college for an elective credit. And I realized, wait a minute, I forgot how much I loved this. So now I'm currently getting my MFA in writing, and I'm going to graduate in March. And I'm also a published poet as well. I have 2 poetry collections.
I read one last night.
You read one last night? And my second one came out a couple weeks ago.
Congratulations.
And the last, crazy thing, I guess, about me is I'm the editor-in-chief of a brand new literary journal called Ghostlight Lit. I don't know if I ever told you that.
No, you haven't. Yeah.
I started this literary journal to publish other people's poetry and fiction and all of that good stuff. So I'm thrilled to be able to do that for other people as people have done for me.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
Wow. And you are from Fort Myers?
Sort of. So I moved to Fort Myers when I was 14, but I'm originally from Maine.
Oh,
Yeah.
we're at in Maine.
In 30 minutes north of Portland.
Okay.
Yeah, a town called Topsom, population very small. And I moved here to Florida 3 days before I started high school,
Okay.
which was terrible.
Do you consider yourself a New Englander, or do you consider yourself a Florida gal?
I'm a Florida gal now. I've been here for 13 years. I did just age myself there and give away my age, but yes, I've been here for 13 years, and I think I'm more of a Florida girl than a New Englander.
Where'd you go to school?
I went to school at Florida Southern College in Lakeland, which is about an hour outside of Orlando. That's where I got my BFA in musical theater, and I'm getting my master's right now from Lindenwood University, which is a school in Missouri, and I'm able to do it all online, which is very cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, the beautiful thing about the 21st century is that we can study anywhere at any time.
Exactly.
It's great. And poetry, which is just something that you can do that anytime.
Yes, and it's very, I mean, there's some programs that are in person that are very beneficial, but with a writing program, you still get the workshop experience online, and it's basically the same thing, just not in person.
And what piqued your interest about poetry? You talked about literature and going into that. And what really stood out about poetry? What made you want to go into that?
Yeah, so I also write novels and short stories and all of that stuff, but I found with poetry that it was a way for me to express my feelings in a way that nothing else could. And I know a lot of times as like an actor, we talk about how we're able to, being on stage is very therapeutic, and it's very freeing, and I find that too when I'm on stage. But when you're on stage, you're kind of told what to say. You have to follow a script. Whereas with poetry, no matter how I'm feeling, I can write it however I want to in a way that makes sense for me, and it's considered art. You know, my kind of strange feelings that I have, I can make sense of them, and people relate to them. And that's kind of what piqued my interest, is that it's just such a kind of freeing art form, and you can kind of do whatever you want and make it as avant-garde as possible, and people will really relate to it.
There's no such thing as a wrong poem.
No. I have this theory. I've taught poetry quite a bit. I taught a poetry residency at a high school like a couple years ago, and my big philosophy on poetry is that everybody is a poet. There's no wrong way to write poetry. There's only structures you can follow, and there's certain things you can do. There's forms you can try, and sort of these unofficial line breaks and rules and stuff that you can follow, but everybody is a poet if you put words on a page, and it's just about expressing your feelings and creating those images.
As an artist, we can put things down on a page and call it good, but we're also in the search for success.
Sure.
What is your definition of success in poetry? Do you consider yourself successful?
Yeah, I think success is definitely an interesting term, because when we look at it in theater, which is what I also know very well, success means that you're a working actor and you're doing what you love to do and you're getting paid for your craft. Whereas when you're a writer, you don't always get that consistent pay. You know what I mean? Like you get royalties for your books, you get advances, you can publish with an independent press, with a large press, all of that stuff. But to me, success is not being published with the biggest publisher or making the most money. Success is, to me, is when somebody reads my book and they're holding it in their hands, my words that I cried over and put into this book, and basically just poured my heart into this book, and people are reading it and they say, wow, I really connected with that poem. It made me think of XYZ. And to me, that is like the best success, is people having my words affect them in such a way. I had, I did a book fair, like maybe a couple years ago, last year maybe, and this older woman read my book, Fragile Hearts Club, and she read this poem that I had written about my father when he went to war when I was about 7 or 8, and she read this poem and she came up to me at my table and she was sobbing, just like sobbing. And I was like, oh my goodness, like what happened? What did I do to you? And she was like, I read your poem, Paper Mache, and it was the most beautiful thing I've ever read. I really connected to it because a similar thing happened to me. All of that. It was just such a nice moment. And to me, that was my moment of, wow, like, yeah. I did it. I really connected with somebody on a really cool level, and that made me feel very successful.
That connection that you talk about, as an actor, that's what I feed off on stage.
Yes, for sure.
I need that connection, and I've never really had that thought in my head about literature, making that connection. To me, you write it, you know, if you can get it published, good for you,
Right.
and it's out there.
Right.
And then you have no control of who reads it, who's getting anything out of it.
Yeah.
And so that, to me, the success of just like seeing somebody read it and tell you. How do you feel about just like publishing it and just saying, well, now it's open for the world?
Oh my gosh, it's scary.
Yeah.
I think it was scarier with my second book because my second book is a little more existential and it's a little deeper than the first one. The first one that I wrote, Fragile Hearts Club, was very sweet and it's about love and it's about finding yourself and all of that stuff. Whereas my second one is a little bit more about questioning things and questioning life and questioning why things happen the way that they do. And I was very nervous to release that one because I wasn't sure what people were going to think and if people were going to be like, oh my goodness, this girl, you know, has a lot of feelings, which we know that I do have a lot of feelings. If you've ever met me, you know that I feel things very deeply.
Rachael has all the feelings.
Surprise! But I was very nervous because there are some poems in that collection that I wrote about some really tough things that I went through in my life and some things that I haven't really shared with people. So to be able to kind of put that out there and to have those things out in the world, I was like, oh boy, I was a little nervous.
Yeah, it was really interesting reading your stuff because when I read poetry, I'm used to Dr. Seuss and Robert Frost talking about this imagery out in the world, but you really were putting into words some things that I felt in my life back in high school, back in elementary school, about my first crush, about somebody who I'd been, you know, admiring for all this time, and I was just like, oh my God, this is the first time I was able to put in words, or somebody else's words, but just to like, it brought up feelings. It really did.
Oh, and that makes me so happy.
Well, thank you. How do you start your creation process?
Ooh.
I know a lot of people will have a notebook that they write things down. Nowadays, there's tablets that you can write things down. How do you get started on a poem?
I write a lot of my poems, and I'm not ashamed of this, but I write them in my notes app on my phone. Sometimes, usually to start, but usually when I'm starting a new collection, I'll have an idea for the collection. For example, I've actually, since these two that I've already published, I have two more that are finished. One of them is in the submission process, and one of them I'm editing right now. And my third poetry collection, I had this idea for a collection. I was like, I really want to write about magicians. And so I had this idea, and I was like, okay, so that's my framework. It's going to be about magic. And then I came up with the title, which is How the Magician Lives. And it kind of just went from there, and I decided based on that title I wrote a poem, and then I sort of broke it up into sections and was like, I want to write about this type of magician, this one, and this one. And then from there the collection kind of just spiraled. I added to it. I'm really proud of where it went, but it did not start where I thought it was going to end. I thought it was going to be an exploration of magic, and the collection actually ended up being an exploration of what it is like to be an actor dealing with mental illness.
Interesting.
Yeah, and so I hope to have it published here soon. But
so you're very open to letting things adapt and change.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I had another poetry collection that I'm working on that's just about finished, and it was originally I was really struggling with where I was going to go with it. I had the title, which is usually what I come up with first, because and that does change over time too, but I had an idea for a title. I wanted to write about astronauts, and I was like, what can I do? How can I work this? And it didn't make any sense to me. I was really struggling with it, so I put it to the side, and then I ended up going through a divorce, as you know, and so the book actually became about an astronaut looking at the world through these rose-colored glasses, and they finally take, or the rose-colored helmet, and they finally take the rose-colored helmet off, which that's a symbol of love, and they see the world for what it really is. And kind of, it's exploring heartbreak and, space travel, which is something I'm super fascinated with. And so that is kind of my fourth collection. That's another one that started somewhere and ended up somewhere completely different from where it originally began.
No, you talked about in the past that your style has no boundaries. One line might be a word, and some might be 2 pages long. How do you, when you're creating a poem, how do you formulate them? How does it come to be?
Yeah, I usually, when I write a poem, what's really important to me is rhythm. And if somebody were to read it out loud, would it not sound good, but would it sound appropriate for the emotion? So like if it's, sometimes I break lines where I want people to take a breath. And so when they're reading it, or when I'm reading it, right, I want to make sure that it sounds good and it's not choppy and it's not too wordy or too dense, that I'm getting the point across very easily. And so a lot of times those line breaks kind of symbolize how I personally want the story to be, or the poem to be interpreted, and the breaths to be taken and all of that stuff. And so it's really cool because a poet has the freedom to choose when they break their own lines. You can break it at any time. And I've been really fortunate in my MFA program to get to read other people's poetry and get to kind of figure out for myself, why did they break it on that line? What was their thought behind that? And so I've taken a look at my own poems and been like, why did I do that? And then it's kind of cool. It adds that extra layer.
You're going to dissect your own poem?
Yeah, I have sometimes. I try not to too much because it stresses me out a little bit. But I do, especially in the editing process of poetry, because there is, like writing a novel or a story or anything, there is a huge editing process with writing poetry. And so those are the times when you have to really meticulously look at the poem and be like, are the line breaks appropriate? Do they make sense? Is the image clear? Is the rhythm, good? Is it consistent? All of that stuff kind of comes about in the editing.
Yeah, and you can tell that you're performing part of your life, your actress really comes out in your poetry. Like you were just explaining, like it's just kind of like a thought process, how you read it, how you breathe with it. And it really lets you tap into that self-expression. And we really get to see Rachael. And I told you before this, your writing is very personal and unique to you, but the way that the reader reads it, it's very relatable.
Oh, I'm so glad. That's my number one goal.
Yeah, no, and I think you pulled it off extremely well.
Oh, thanks.
What gets your creative juices flowing?
What
do you like to do?
Well, specifically like the types of feelings that get my creative juices flowing, because I have to be kind of, I like to write about certain things. So feeling-wise, I write a lot about love and a lot about heartbreak. However, what gets my actual juices flowing is sometimes I like to go for walks and look at nature, which I don't ever write about nature, but I do incorporate elements of nature as metaphor. So sometimes I do go for walks and stuff and I just look around me, and sometimes it makes me feel a little existential, and I'll be like, why do I feel this way when I'm going for a walk? It's all very silly, but that's kind of what gets me in the writing mood, I should say. I also I try to write just about every day, and usually it's in the middle of the day for some reason. That is my peak time, which is funny because all writers have a different time for them, but for me it's like the afternoon, and I'll pour myself a cup of coffee and just sit there on my couch, and the sun is shining, and it's just the perfect time of day. So that's kind of my creative, what's the word I'm looking for? That's my
catalyst.
Yeah.
That's a good one. And what inspires you? You talked a little bit about nature, and I talked briefly about Robert Frost, my little knowledge of poetry, and how he uses imagery, and how you kind of can take that the imagery from nature and you use it into your self-expression. But is there anything else that really just drives you? You also talk about heartbreak, and I'm not encouraging everybody to go out and just get heartbroken a lot to become a poet.
Right, yeah.
But what else inspires you?
Yeah, so like I had said before about like the astronauts and like the magic and the stars, I'm very inspired by certain elements that I read about a lot. One of them being stars, which I wrote a whole collection about. The Meaning of Stars is a very like celestial kind of inspired collection. I also write a lot about astronauts and the idea of space travel. I don't know why it fascinates me so much, but to me there's such like a connection between the vastness of space and the vastness of life, and kind of just like the existential kind of, I feel like I've been saying that word a lot, but I do write a lot about some sort of like big thoughts that I have. And I write a lot about magic as well, a lot of elements, because to me, I do write a lot about heartbreak, but a lot of who I am as a person is being optimistic about life and being optimistic about the future and finding magic in just life and being able to do what I love to do. So I do write a lot about some pretty hard things that I've gone through, and I don't shy away from that at all, but I'm very inspired by certain elements like stars and space and magic and all that stuff.
Now, the way we've been talking, it makes it seem like Rachel's pen is just flowing all the time. I'm sure you've run into some creative blocks.
Oh, yes.
How do you overcome them?
Yeah, I certainly do. I think one way that I really overcome them is I just kind of write without the thought of being published, if that makes sense. So like one day I might sit there and be like, I cannot think of a single thing. So what I'll do is I'll sit down and be like, I'm going to write something right now with no intention of it ever getting published. I'm just going to write exactly what I'm thinking, what I'm feeling. And 99% of the time, it's pretty much just like a stream of consciousness. It doesn't make any sense. But occasionally, in that 1%, there is like one line within that jumble that I'm like, ooh, that's a really cool thing I just thought of. Let me pull that out of the mess and let me expand on that. And so usually that is what kind of helps me overcome that writer's block. I've done that more times than I can count.
So a lot of artists that I've interviewed like to step away from their craft. They like to go away, do something completely different.
Yeah.
But you're more of just like, I'm just going to continue writing.
Yeah.
And see what happens basically subconsciously.
Yeah. I think also being in an MFA program, I'm not allowed to go away from it. Because if I do, then I fail the class. So I think being in the MFA program has really forced me to overcome my writer's block, and in moments, and that's not to say that I'm immune to writer's block at all times, because it comes to me at the worst possible moments. However, writing is such an integral part of who I am that sometimes, I did it this morning actually. I was sitting on my couch and I was like, you know what, I haven't written in a couple days. Let me just write something. And I just wrote about a feeling that I was feeling this morning, and it might not ever make it to a poetry collection, but I just wrote it down. And usually what I'll do is if I write something, I will leave that thing for a few days or a week or 2 weeks and come back to it later and revisit it and edit it. But I never quite step away from writing completely. One, because I'm not allowed to with my MFA program, and two, because I don't necessarily want to, because it does help me a lot as someone who does struggle with mental illness. It does help me to kind of live my day-to-day life, if that makes sense. Yeah.
It's your little creative outlet as
for
well
sure.
as your crutch as
Yes.
well as, yeah. Oh.
It's a little bit of everything.
What hobbies do you have? And do you think
Ooh.
that they complement or contradict your craft?
Ooh.
I know that one of your big hobbies is being on stage,
What?
which we talked about a little bit.
Yeah.
But is there anything that you do that can get you away from poetry, or that really inspires you to do more?
Yeah, so I, of course, am an actor, and I think that acting really complements writing in so many different ways, because I'm constantly around scripts and I'm around characters, and I'm able to kind of incorporate that into my writing. But some other things that I do is I teach a lot. I teach voice lessons and I teach other musical theater stuff. Sometimes I teach writing, and that also helps me. Yes, it's still within the world of it, but it does help me kind of see it from a different perspective. And then especially when I teach poetry, which is one of my most favorite things to do, I'm able to look at it from a more academic perspective, and I do incorporate that sometimes in my analysis of my own poems and making them stronger and making them better. But another hobby that I have is I love to go to the beach, and I love to metal detect on the beach, which is like so random and has nothing to do with writing, but there's something about like finding like lost things that really inspires me just in my life. That's a little fun fact I don't think you knew about me.
I have no idea.
Yeah, so I like to do that, and I love being outdoors. I'm a very outdoorsy gal.
Since the hurricane, have you found any treasures?
I actually found something kind of sad. I was on Fort Myers Beach, and I found the blade of a fan underneath the sand from somebody's house.
Oh my god.
Yeah. Treasure-wise, I did find was it a penny from like 1943?
Okay.
Which is like crazy. Like we find a lot of cool coins and stuff, but nothing like jewelry or anything yet.
You think you'll ever write a poem about metal detecting?
I think so.
Okay.
I think that there is some kind of poem or story from the finding of lost things.
Yeah.
I'm also like really big on this idea of like even if you are lost in life, you can find the good in it. And I think that yes, it's a little metaphorical, but like metal detecting definitely like kind of lends itself into that idea. So I think so.
I mean, we're in space with a rose helmet.
Exactly. Why not? And that's the other thing about writing is, one thing I used to do a lot is I used to censor myself, and I used to think, oh, that's kind of a stupid idea. I shouldn't do that. But especially with the idea of the astronaut in the rose-colored helmet, which is the title of my 4th collection, that's just a title I came up with, and I was like, you know what? No, this is like, I know what this means, and if I know what it means, then maybe somebody else will. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense to everybody, and it might be a little bit of a strange idea, but to me, if I'm really passionate about it, then that's all that matters, really, to me. Because if I'm passionate about it, surely somebody else will find something of use in it.
It doesn't need to make sense to everyone.
Yeah.
Well,
that's my philosophy.
That's art.
Yeah. Yep.
Are there any misconceptions about your craft?
Yes. Tons. I think that people often think that poetry is really hard to understand. And I don't disagree with that. I think that a lot of poems can be difficult to understand, even for me. And I've been studying it for years, and I think that there is this misconception that, oh, well, poetry is an academic art. It's too complicated. But what we've found with a lot of modern poets, which has been really exciting to see, is there's a lot more relatability. As you read my poetry collection, and you're not, necessarily somebody who enjoys reading, but you still found something of value because of kind of this new wave of modern poetry, which is more about making it more accessible for every type of reader in person. It's not about making the most complicated thought anymore. It's more about, well, how can I make this relatable? So yeah, I think the big misconception is that it's hard to understand. And while I don't agree, I think that is changing.
Yeah, and I think the way that you try and reach your audience, it's not about, the pretty words and the long...
Exactly, yeah.
You're about the connection.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that connection is had.
Yes, and I'm not alone in that. There are so many poets who are the exact same way, some that have really inspired me in my own writing. And so I am certainly not the pioneer in that. There are plenty of others who kind of take that approach.
Any other misconceptions?
Oh, yes, actually. I think another misconception is that poetry has to rhyme.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I personally, I'm not going to say that I dislike rhyming poems, because I think there is a time and a place for them, and I think people who write them, they have just as much credibility as I do. Personally, I am not a rhyming poet, because to me, in my poetry journey, it kind of limits what I can do a little bit. And that's not to say that some of my poems don't rhyme, because they do. But I think that's a really big misconception that poems have to rhyme, because they absolutely don't. And that goes along with the free verse form, which is how I write. Free verse is any structure you want. And so it does not follow a rhyme scheme or structure or a specific type of form.
The way that you write in the book that I read last night, most of the time I have to go back and reread a section and be like, I swear that rhymed.
Yeah.
And you go back and you go like, it didn't rhyme. It was
Yeah.
just the flow of your narrative.
Oh, thank you. I do enjoy a good internal rhyme.
Yeah.
So the words maybe aren't the same. Like they don't rhyme, but there's like a little bit of a kind of either a rhythmic similarity, or there's like a vowel that's similar. I don't, but sometimes those are, and actually not sometimes, probably like 99.9% of the time, those are completely intentional on my part, and then I'm like, oh, what did I do? I did it. But yeah, it's a lot about, for me, writing is a lot about how it sounds out loud, and does it have a good flow?
Well, I'm going to continue to pick your brain, because
Okay.
as an aspiring lyricist,
Please
most
do.
of my rhymes are very Dr. Seuss-y.
Yeah. I didn't know you were an aspiring lyricist.
Yes,
That's really cool.
my thesis for graduate
What?
school was that I wrote a musical.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
What? I had no idea. That is so cool.
So, just trying to get the lyrics to portray what I'm trying to say, as well as rhyming. It's just another, like you said, it's a lot less free verse. It's a lot more constrictive, but as well as like, if you can get it to rhyme, like put some words.
Sweet. Yeah. I think a lot of like, and I've seen a lot of rhyming poems that are so stellar and so insanely good. And we see it in songwriting too. Like songs mostly have some sort of a rhyme scheme, because that's just how songwriting is, modern songwriting. But I think a lot of times in musical theater and in poetry and stuff, we are seeing this shift of like, especially in like Pasek and Paul, where like things don't always necessarily rhyme. It's more about what is the line, how is the line being sung to convey the emotion. I think it's so much more about the emotions than it is about like, oh, this has to sound perfect. You know, it's more about, is this line exactly what I want it to say? And if so, great. How can I make that melodic line make sense within that one line? You know, it doesn't necessarily, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think people get really hung up on the rhyming, and I think it's definitely beneficial, but I think it's more about how the poem or the song conveys that feeling. And is it making sense? Great. Then how do you structure that melodic line on top of it to complement those words? I'm no songwriter, but that's
could be.
I guess you could put music to my poems. Why not?
Good.
I guess.
You sing. You're a beautiful singer.
Oh,
too.
thank you. I did actually. So in Fragile Hearts Club, my first book, a lot of the poems that I wrote were actually taken from songs I wrote as a kid. And actually, so my grandfather taught me a lot about writing and about music, and he was a huge influence on my life, and so we used to write songs together. And he actually just passed away 4 months ago. Thank you. But he was a huge influence on my life. And so I had found during the pandemic all of these journals of songs that I had written, mostly about boys, and you know, as a young teenage girl does, but about boys and about all of this stuff. And a lot of that was because of the things my grandfather had taught me about how to structure songs. He was actually a professional musician my whole entire life, and up until he passed away, he was a professional musician. And so he really influenced me a lot. But all that to say that in Fragile Hearts Club, some of those poems were taken from songs I had written, and a lot of them had a rhyme scheme that just didn't make sense because I was 13 and I was just playing around. So I edited those songs. I found them, I edited them, and I put them into into the poetry collection. So some of the poems that you'll see in that collection were actually originally songs that I wrote as a child, teenager. Yeah.
Drawing inspiration from yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's a little meta, but yeah. I suppose.
Do you advise an aspiring poet to go to school? Do you think it's necessity?
Not necessarily. I think you can be successful with or without schooling. Personally, I'm getting my MFA because I want to teach at the collegiate level one day. So I had a very clear path in mind, and the reason why I wanted to do that was to teach and to also potentially work in the publishing industry, which is something I'm very passionate about as well. However, just like in theater, you don't necessarily need to get a theater degree to be successful. I think you don't necessarily need to get a writing degree to become a successful writer. Does that mean that writing degrees are not beneficial? No, I think they're very beneficial for networking and workshopping opportunities and learning more about the craft. But I would say it kind of depends on the individual aspiring poet's path in life and where they see themselves.
How do you handle criticism?
Oof.
You are, I'd say, a successful poet. You have published a few books,
you.
working on a few. I'm sure you've had some people go, I don't get it.
I have plenty, including who I love you, family who's listening, but my family will occasionally be like, I just didn't get it. And the thing is kind of like what I was saying about the astronaut in the rose-colored helmet. Sometimes people don't get it, and I've had to be okay with that. That's not to say that people's criticisms are not valid. I've been in the MFA program for about a little over a year now, and I have to workshop my work constantly. And it's the idea of putting your words up in front of people, and basically their goal is to give you as much feedback as possible to strengthen it. And so when you get that criticism, you have to kind of look at it from a different lens, not as this is a personal attack on me, but as a lens of, okay, maybe these people are really trying to help me and make my work better. And I think being an actor has helped immensely with me having a little bit of a thicker skin when it comes to my writing, because in acting I'm used to being rejected constantly for jobs, and I'm used to, doing a show and getting a review, and you don't know what the review is going to be like, and it's the exact same for writing books. Luckily, I've never had anybody publicly give me a bad review, so I don't have any experience on that. But that's not to say that people have not, at book fairs and other things, have not come up to me and said, I don't really understand this poem. And sometimes that opens up a dialogue about the poem, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes that's just what it is, and I just have to take it for what it is and believe in my own work.
So you definitely accept criticism.
Oh yes, I wouldn't say I love criticism, but I'm always open to the opportunity to strengthen my craft and to be a better writer, whether that's from somebody in my MFA program, my teacher, if that's from another writer friend, if that's even from a family member that's like, Rachael, I don't understand this poem. Maybe there's a reason for that, and maybe I do need to revisit it. Mm-hmm. So it's definitely, I'm definitely open to it, and I'm very fortunate because of theater to have a thick skin to be able to accept it.
Yeah, and to use that parallel from a different craft to be able to use it. That's really interesting. Yeah. Speaking of reviews, I just had to bring up our most current review of Murder on the Orient Express, where Miss Rachael Lord was called out for being quirky and funny.
I try my best. Those are two great words to describe this character, I think, that I play on stage. So.
It's brilliant.
Yeah.
You bring a little bit of comic relief,
and
then all of a sudden it just kind of turns, and so many feelings.
All of the feelings.
Do you have any funny, interesting stories or events that have happened in your poetry, just off the top of your head?
Oh gosh. Not that I nothing really like funny, haha, laugh, but something interesting is that in Fragile Hearts Club, there's a couple of pictures in the book itself, and those were actually drawn by my 10-year-old sister.
I was gonna ask.
Yeah, and so I guess this is kind of a little funny story, but she did about 5 pictures for it, and it was really important to me that she be involved in this book because it was dedicated to her. One of the people that I dedicated this book was to Avery, to my sister, and so but she is so funny. Every time she goes into a writing class or like an English class in her school, she's done this for the past 3 years that my book has been out, she will raise her hand in class. And my mom tells me every time she does this, she'll raise her hand and be like, well, my sissy published a poetry book. And so this has happened for the past 3 years. Every time she starts a new class, she will bring in my poetry book and she will share it with her whole class. And I think it's really cute. And then she'll open the book to the pictures and be like, I drew this. I'm a professional illustrator. Which I think is funny. And I did pay her for those pictures. I gave her $5 a picture, which kind of feels like a crime. But she was 8, I think, at the time that she drew them. So.
And how old is she now?
She's 10.
10 now.
Yeah, this book came out in 2021. I believe she was 8 and she's 10 now. I'm going to be 11.
She's such a proud sister.
She is. She's very sweet, and she has been a huge inspiration for a lot of my writing. Especially, there's a couple of poems in The Meaning of Stars that are about her and about our relationship. We have a 16-and-a-half-year age gap between us, and so that's kind of given me a different perspective on life, whereas she's definitely like one of my little BFFs, but she's also like somebody that I'm very protective over. And so yeah, I write a lot about her too.
And what's next for the world of your craft? There's so many things that are happening with you personally.
Yes.
I don't want to bring in anything dark, but you did mention that you just went through a divorce. I'm sure that's inspiring a lot of your creativity.
Yes, it sure is. Going through a divorce has forced me to rethink some things about what I thought about, or what I thought I knew about love and relationships. And so I do have a poetry collection about that. That is The Astronaut in the Rose-Colored Helmet. That's the working title right now. I don't know if that will be the official title, but I hope it will be because I like it. But something else I'm exploring, which is something I hoped I would never have to write about, but it is something that is inspiring a lot of poems, is the loss of my grandfather. And so I haven't quite been able to write any poems yet because it is still so fresh, and it is something I haven't quite come to terms with in my grief journey. But that is certainly something that I will be exploring as a way to explore my feelings, but also as a way to memorialize him too. Yeah. Because he was such a wonderful man and a huge influence on my life and who I am as a creative artist, that it only feels right to memorialize him through what I love to do, which is writing. So I'm hoping to do that. As far as what's next for me publishing wise, my third book, How the Magician Lives, which is probably the book I am the proudest of in the whole world. I think it is one of my, it's the deepest that I will go in a poetry collection, I think, ever. Because it deals with so many things. That one is on submission right now, so I'm hoping, maybe in the next year I will have some publishing news about that, and then we'll see kind of where that journey goes. But as of right now, I'm writing a lot, trying to finish my MFA, and kind of just going with the flow and seeing what happens for me. I have found in my life that you cannot predict anything. You can't predict it. You can't quite plan for it because life changes all of the time. So I'm trying to adopt that in my creative journey as well.
Wonderful. So great. And you have 2 published books, The Fragile Hearts Club and The Meaning of Stars. Yes. And where can we find these?
They are available on Amazon. They're also available on Barnes & Noble online.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful.
Yes.
Is there anything else you want to talk about?
No, just thank you so much for having me. This was so fun. I'm so honored to get to talk about my favorite thing, poetry, with one of my favorite people, Scoop.
Aww.
So I'm just so thrilled to be here, and thanks for having me.
Oh, and thank you for opening my
Of
eyes
course.
to a new craft and piquing my interest. Thank you to all my peakers out there for listening. Please let me know if you have any special or unique artists or forms that you think I should explore. Remember, creativity comes from the heart. Push yourselves. Be kind to each other. I'm Scoop Decker, and thank you for helping me pique my interest. And as an extra added bonus, Miss Rachael Lord is going to read some excerpts from her book.
This one is the final poem in The Meaning of Stars. This one is called Black Holes Don't Suck. And this is how it goes. Black holes don't suck, and constellations are just coincidence. Stars don't twinkle, and the sun is just another one of them. Yet on the stars, we wish and hope and pray that we'll find our way. But really, it was us the whole damn time.